The United States is, quite simply, the world's leading power. We're talking about an economy of some 350 million people and the highest disposable income per household in the entire OECD. Higher than Luxembourg, higher than Switzerland, and even higher than Norway, with all its oil and its supersized welfare state. And take note, we're not talking about average income, but median income. In other words, the richest 1%, the group that plays in a whole different league in the US, isn't skewing the statistics. But perhaps the most surprising thing is this. Despite being a wealthy country, it continues to grow at breakneck speed. In the last 6 months alone, the United States posted 4% growth. Yes, as if it were an emerging economy, more typical of China than of a developed country. To give you an idea, in the 1990s, the Eurozone produced 80% per capita of what the US produced. These days, it barely reaches 70%. And clearly, the big question is, how did they do it? How did the United States become so wealthy? Many point to the end of World War II, which left Europe in tatters. But be careful, because even before World War I, the US already had giants like US Steel and Standard Oil dominating the business world. And not only that, assembly line production as we know it was born there. So were the inventions of Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. So, understanding how this nation became wealthy isn't just key to understanding the American economy, it's essential to understanding the Industrial Revolution itself. Because yes, people often talk about a first industrial revolution in England and a second, more American one, but the real story is far more interesting. A century after its independence, the US tripled its GDP per capita. Its population was 16 times larger, and thus its GDP increased 50-fold. In just 60 years, from 1810 to 1870, the share of industry in employment jumped from 3% to 20%. These figures cannot be explained solely by technological progress or the vast size of the American continent. During these years, the United States adopted an economic structure that was much more distinct from that of countries like the United Kingdom than it might seem at first glance, and believe me, this is very rare. Think about it. The US was a vast, sprawling country, rich in natural resources, but with a less skilled workforce than its former compatriots in the United Kingdom, not to mention the enormous role slavery played in the South. Given these circumstances, you would have expected this country to become a dominant force in the primary sector, but not the world's leading industrial power, and in record time, no less. So the questions are clear. What exactly did the US do to become so wealthy? Why do we say that its industrial revolution was different from that of the United Kingdom? What role did slavery, the government, and wars play in this whole story? We will tell you all about it in this video. But first, if you're interested in the world of investing, if you want to learn how to manage your savings, protect yourself against inflation, and figure out how to make money beyond your day job, I've got some news for you. At Visual Factory, we have created the Visual Factory Club, a newsletter where every week we send out free content focused on essential financial education, the ABC of what everyone should know to understand the stock market, financial markets in general, investment platforms, how to assess investment opportunities, and which markets may have more or less potential. Because of course, if you want to invest your money so you're not at the mercy of your country's economic instability, you at least need to understand the basics of the financial world. In the Visual Factory Club, you'll learn all of this completely free of charge through the link below and this QR code. You can sign up for the club and start receiving the upcoming editions. What's more, when you sign up, you'll receive a dossier where I explain in a clear and simple way the most essential investment concepts. What multiples or the PE ratio are, what indices are, ETFs, derivatives, funds, EPS, you get the idea. After that, every week you'll receive additional materials and market analysis to help you stay informed about what's going on. And by the way, the sooner you sign up, the better. Since we send each episode of the series by email, and every edition is unique, if you're not subscribed, you might miss some of them and you won't be able to access them later. But with that said, let's get into the video. First of all, let's get one thing straight. The United States was never a poor country. Even in colonial times, its GDP per capita was already around 75% of that of the United Kingdom, and that, for the time, placed it among the richest countries on the planet. Now then, the problem wasn't wealth, but growth, or rather, the lack thereof. To give you an idea, in 1700, US GDP per capita was $64, adjusted to $1840. And do you know how much it rose 75 years later? To a meager $67, almost almost the same amount. And the early years of independence weren't spectacular either. Between the ratification of the Constitution and 1830, the US grew at 0.6% annually. Meanwhile, in Europe, some countries were already exceeding 1%. But watch out, something big was already brewing beneath that calm surface. During the first half of the 19th century, the US experienced what economists call extensive growth. What does that mean? Basically, doing more by bringing in more people. More immigrants, more hands at work. In fact, the curious thing is that capital contributed barely 0.2 of a percentage point to growth. What mattered were the people. But then, starting in 1850, things changed completely.
In the second half of the 19th century, however, capital investments emerged as the most important source of growth, accompanied by a near doubling of the contribution of TFP to growth. Between 4/5 and 3/4 of 19th century economic growth was attributable to increases in per capita inputs.
And what was the key to this great change? The Americanization of British innovations. You see, although London tried by every means to prevent its inventions from crossing the Atlantic, even going so far as to ban the emigration of its most skilled artisans, in the end, contact between the two countries was too close. Everything leaked out eventually. The Napoleonic Wars also played a role. With the United Kingdom cut off from the rest of Europe, its trade depended more than ever on the American market. And of course, amid all that back and forth, ideas travelled too. Later, it was the Americans who closed themselves off from the world, but by then, the seeds had already been planted. Now, the interesting thing isn't that they copied British technologies, anyone could do that. What made the difference was how they adapted them. To give you an idea, well into the 19th century, water wheels were 100 times more common than steam engines in US factories. Why? Couldn't they afford steam? Quite the opposite. Steamships experienced a real boom. Between 1815 and 1860, they increased the productivity of river trade tenfold. But of course, in factories, water still reigned supreme. Reason? Very simple. In a country with mighty rivers, plenty of cheap land, and low population density, water wheels were more efficient than steam. In fact, by 1820, the US was already generating the equivalent of 2,560 tons of oil in energy, 5 times more than all of Western Europe combined. And this pattern repeated itself in other sectors as well. They adopted the latest British looms, yes, but they didn't use them as is. They always put their own spin on them. The true American miracle was this. Not so much inventing from scratch, but improving what came from abroad, just as China does today with Western technology.
Both the British and American textile industries were technologically dynamic, but they were proceeding down distinct technological paths. The British industry relied on a craft-like technology, dependent on the skills of the operators, while the American approach relied on machinery that reduced skill requirements and extended its capability along other dimensions.
The problem for the US was clear. Its coal was much more expensive than British coal. Nor did it have that army of highly skilled artisans who were the crown jewel of the United Kingdom. The solution? Adapt British inventions to run on water, which was much more abundant, and use less specialised workers. But also keep in mind, the Americans also had their own ace up their sleeve. Fierce competition on all fronts. By the late 19th century, they already had geniuses like Thomas Edison. But the real driving force behind innovation wasn't the big names, but ordinary people. In 1840, 80% of patients in the US belonged to inventors who had only 1 or 2 registered ideas. That's 15% more than at the end of the 18th century. And why was there so much competition? For 2 key reasons. First, because of the enormous flexibility of the labour market and the financial system. If you had a good idea, you could start a business and wipe out the competition without impossible permits or guilds to shut the door on you. But the second reason is even more significant, because this is where the US makes the biggest difference compared to the British model. We're talking about standardized interchangeable parts and the birth of assembly line production. These days, it sounds obvious, but even well into the Industrial Revolution, it was normal for the parts of a single product not to be interchangeable with one another. Yes, factories used machines, they produced more, but at heart, they still operated like artisanal workshops. Each part was fitted by hand. Everything was custom made. Changing that was, precisely, the Great American Revolution. And no, it didn't happen by chance. It all began in a very specific place: the military.
An improvement is made here in the construction of the musket. It consists in making every part of them so exactly alike that what belongs to anyone may be used for every other musket in the magazine. Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson was captivated by the advances being made in France regarding the standardization of weapons production, making it extremely easy to replace parts. And it wasn't just a passing fancy. When he came to power, he decided to create an entire public arms industry based on this very philosophy. It was no trivial matter, because this industry quickly became one of the largest in the country. It grew so much that it not only supplied the army, but also operated in the regular civilian market. Now then, production with interchangeable parts is great in the midst of a war, but the truth is that economically it was less competitive than the more traditional method. Mind you, this isn't all that unusual. Tesla's Optimus robots are also manufactured today using very artisanal methods. It's not a backward method, it's the optimal approach for certain types of products. But clearly, public arms manufacturers couldn't go bankrupt and leave the country without a national military industry, so the government approved tariffs to protect them from foreign competition.
The manufacturing methods developed in the United States would not have survived in competition with imported goods. Rather, the early development of the use of specialized machinery and the emphasis on interchangeable parts were made possible only because manufacturers received considerable support from the federal government.
In the short term, this meant an extra cost for Americans. But this new way of doing things spread to other industries at breakneck speed, giving rise to a much more efficient form of production in the long run. The little brother of the assembly line that Henry Ford would popularize a few decades later. Now, not everything is so rosy. We've just seen how tariffs helped establish the American production model, but they didn't stop there. Although they were likely beneficial during the early years of the 19th century, politicians like Alexander Hamilton and businessmen like those in the Boston Group wanted to go much further. Nevertheless, many economic historians such as Douglas Irving and Peter Termin agreed that by 1830, or 1850 at the latest, tariffs had ceased to be beneficial and had become a major hindrance. In fact, according to the best study available to date, tariffs were not exactly a blessing. Quite the opposite. They had a negative impact on productivity, and a significant one at that. To give you an idea, we all know that wages are closely linked to productivity, right? Well, these authors estimate that if tariffs hadn't slowed productivity growth, the average wage in 1909 wouldn't have been $1,630, but $2,500. In short, those early tariffs helped establish a production model in the US that, in the short term, was inefficient. But in the long run, it took off like a rocket. Add to that fierce domestic competition, a domestic market with virtually no barriers, and companies with enviable dynamism, and you've got half the recipe for the American miracle. But wait. Only half? Because there's a huge elephant in the room, one we haven't talked about yet. We've said that American success was based, among other things, on the fact that anyone could have a good idea, start a business, and compete with the big players. But what happens when the big players swallow up all the small ones? Yes, let's talk about the Golden Age. A rather ironic term, by the way, coined by Mark Twain to describe an era of apparent splendor, but rife with corruption, inequality, and monopolies. It's the era of the industrial titans, of Standard Oil, of the so-called robber barons. Names like J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, businessmen who dominated not only the United States, but half the planet. And how did they get rich? According to the most popular narrative, not by adding value, but through extortion, corruption, and market hoarding. But what if that version weren't entirely true? Yes, these companies were monopolies, but be careful, that doesn't mean they had absolute power over the market. Because even if they had no direct competition, the mere possibility that a new player might enter the market was enough to force them to keep innovating. Either they got their act together, or someone else would come along and steal their thunder. And that precisely is what they did. According to a recent and very comprehensive study, the major mergers of that era did not create slow, clumsy behemoths. On the contrary, they gave rise to giants far more productive than their predecessors. This was crucial in the US, a country that, unlike Europe, didn't have centuries-old universities training technical elites. So, who took charge of research and development? Well, these megacorporations. And given the economic growth and technological advances that followed, it's clear that it wasn't a bad bet. It's estimated that this great wave of corporate mergers increased industrial innovation by 13% during the first decades of the 20th century. And pure science? a 30% increase in discoveries. All of that concentrated in just 90 companies that accounted for 12% of United States GDP. And keep in mind, 70 of them controlled half of their respective sectors. And there's more. Because another of the great myths of this era is that inequality skyrocketed, but the actual data tells a very different story. You see, it's true that the highest wages grew significantly during this period, but that's not the whole story. Because there's a crucial detail that's almost always overlooked. Inflation doesn't affect the rich and the poor the same way. And what was the difference? That the cost of living for the poor fell much more sharply. And here, a name you all know comes into the picture: Rockefeller, along with his company, Standard Oil. Before oil, lighting your home was something only the rich could afford. Whale oil was used, a luxury available to very few. But with kerosene, everything changed. Thanks to these new industrial giants, the poor could finally have light in their homes. Yes, the rich benefited too, but for them the change was marginal. Of course, we're not saying that Rockefeller and company were nuns, far from it. Many of these tycoons were corrupt, violent, and didn't hesitate to crush unions if necessary. But here's the interesting part: they didn't slow down the American economy. Quite the opposite. If we look back in history, we see that other commercial powers such as Venice, Genoa, or Florence were also immensely wealthy. But their merchant elites ended up seizing political power, and when the Black Death struck in the mid-14th century, they were merely a shadow of their former selves. In contrast, the United States' economic growth continued, solid, unstoppable. And if we had to pinpoint a single key to American success, it would be this: growth as solid as a rock. If we look at the evolution of GDP per capita on a logarithmic scale, so as not to be misled by exponential growth, one thing stands out immediately. Since around 1830, US growth has essentially been a straight line. Neither the Great Depression nor World War II changed the trend. They merely created a small short-term distortion. And setting those examples aside, we see that Uncle Sam has always grown at 2% annually, with ridiculously low volatility. On top of everything we've covered in this video, there are two key factors that explain this consistency. Number one, the US has not fought any wars against another major power on its own territory. Contrary to popular belief, wars are not good for business. It is estimated that during the 20th century, countries that experienced a war on their own territory saw an average irrecoverable drop in GDP of 13%. Keep in mind that wars don't just destroy wealth. After a military conflict, inflation always follows as a consequence of the excessive debt or money printing required to finance the war. And while I'm sure I don't need to explain the damage inflation does to economic growth, but there are more reasons. And that is, number two, Americans have not experienced political upheavals as radical as those Europe endured in the 20th century, which were also closely tied to wars. It's true that Uncle Sam has his own ghosts in the form of slavery and the treatment of the African American population, but the specters of socialism and fascism had a much smaller impact. In fact, ethnic diversity was precisely one of the reasons these ideologies never really took hold.
In a diverse society where income inequality is deeply connected with race, it is easier for the rich, read white, especially in the past, to view the poor, in segments belonging to racial minorities, especially blacks, as different.
As a result, even the most left-leaning American politicians were more likely to advocate for more pro-capitalist policies, so to speak. And believe me, this is very important. What's more, as we explained in great detail in our video on the Marshall Plan, the great success of this program was to make European countries more like the US, thereby neutralizing the influence of anti-capitalist parties. Precisely for this reason, after World War II, Europe grew systematically much faster than before. And now we've gotten this far, it's your turn. Did you know that the US has grown so robustly, or did you expect more crises and moments of euphoria? Were you aware of the difference between the British and American production systems? To what extent can we explain the US's current wealth through this historical context? You can leave your answers down in the comments. And if you want to understand what's really happening in the markets and learn how to manage your money with more confidence, join the Visual Factory Club. It's completely free and the link is in the description. If you like this video, hit like and subscribe and we can see you in the next one. Best regards. See you soon.